All right, so today we're going to talk about the God of the impossible. And God is the God of the impossible, right? I mean, after all, would he be the God of the Bible if he was not also the God of the impossible? So knowing that God is capable of what we think of as impossible, I think is extremely important for most Christians, because our belief in it, or our disbelief in it, really governs a lot of the decisions that we make when we're asked to step out on faith. I mean, the simple fact is, would I have dared to bring my family away, thousands of miles away from everything they had ever known, everything I had ever known, on the promise of a call coming to Poland to do whatever we are going to do, if I did not have an actual belief that God was the God of the impossible? I mean, if he was just the God of the average, or the God of the sort of kind of when he feels like it, would I have been willing to do something like that? And of course the answer is no. So anytime we step out on faith, the idea that God is the God of the impossible is the road that rises to meet us. There's a scene in Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade. I don't know if you've ever seen it, when he steps out and suddenly he realizes he's standing on something solid. Well, that's sort of like what the impossible for God is to us. We feel like something can't happen. We feel like something is impossible. We feel like this is pointless. Why are we doing this? God, why are you asking me to do this? And suddenly he comes through. So understanding the impossible, I think, is very important to understanding our faith. The problem is, I'd argue that we're impossibly confused over the idea of the possible or the impossible. And there's as much bad teaching out there on this topic for believers and non-believers alike. I should get that out there. Non-believers are no better necessarily informed, I've found, about the idea of the impossible than believers are. So let's take a step back for a moment and let's start with a definition, or two. What is impossible and what is improbable? Well, the word impossible usually means something that by definition never ever could happen in this universe. So an example that I can give you of that would be a two-dimensional square circle. Okay, the definition of a square in 2 dimensions is it has 4 corners, each of which measure 90 degrees. The definition of a circle is that it does not have any angles. If you add an angle to a circle, it ceases to be a circle. And if you take away the angles from a square, it ceases to be a square. So the idea of a square circle is impossible. It could never happen, no matter what you tried to do in 2-dimensional space. Now, the improbable, on the other hand, is something that is unlikely to happen based on what we know. Now, we've maybe never experienced it, or we've experienced it so rarely that the chances of it happening again are very, very, very unlikely. And so based on current knowledge, previous experience, we can say that this thing happening is improbable. And an example of that, sadly, is I can say it is extremely improbable that I will wake up tomorrow morning and someone will have magically transferred 1 million zlotys into my account. Now, why do I say that's improbable? Because there's nothing physically stopping that from happening. There are millionaires out there. These millionaires sometimes take wild hares and they decide to deposit money in random people's accounts. We've heard about those types of things happening. There is nothing in the bank that would prevent that from happening if some millionaire decided they wanted to drop $1 million into my account. But at the same time, am I going to go out today and buy a new flat because I'm just sure that some millionaire is going to give me 1 million zloty? No, absolutely not. And so we would say that is improbable. But here's where it gets confusing, is because people mix the two words up. If you were to come to me right now and say, just in conversation, hey, do you think somebody's going to give you 1 million zlotys? I'd say, it's impossible. Because what I mean is that it's so improbable that it may as well be impossible. I'm going to act like it's impossible. And so this is important because, technically speaking, a lot of the miracles that we see in the Bible that people call impossible really are improbable. And that's important, just in general, because we don't see the Red Sea part every other week or so. And if I went to the Red Sea and you said, part the Red Sea, I'd have no idea how to do it. And I couldn't tell you someone who could other than God. But at the same time, it's still possible, according to all of the laws of physics and whatnot, if God chose to make that happen. And so we consider the idea of doing it unlikely. And of course, you can also point out, with miracles in general, if miracles happened on a daily basis, would they by definition still be miracles? I mean, isn't part of the idea of a miracle that it is something that is very rare, something very unexpected? When we get into and we talk about being possible and impossible and whatnot, I don't think it's any indictment on God when we start talking about miracles to say that miracles are rare, therefore whatever. But really when you get down to it, that could be another whole sermon about the idea of miracles, and so I will leave that be for now. Well, when you talk to people outside the church and you hear the word impossible thrown around about God, you often hear it in the context of God is impossible. Particularly if you spend any time on the internet and you run into an internet atheist, they're going to be throwing this type of language around at you. This idea that God is impossible. Well, I'd like to consider that for a moment. The first and most obvious question I hope that pops into your mind when somebody says, you believe in God? God's impossible. Of course, first they're implicitly calling you an idiot. And that is really the sting of that argument, is they don't want you to feel like you should say, oh no, I don't want to do that because I don't want you to consider me an idiot. But I hope that what really pops into your head the first time isn't that, it's to ask, says who? According to what authority? On what do you base this idea that there is no God? Where do you get this from? And how do you think you can state it so authoritatively that you can say not just that I'm not convinced of God, but that God is impossible, that He could never exist? Well, there are two basic ways that you can answer that question. First, you can take someone else's word for it. You can say that Richard Dawkins or Stephen Hawking or Christopher Hitchens or whoever the philosopher du jour happens to be, they don't believe in Him, so I'm not going to believe in Him either. Therefore, I think He's impossible. But when you really get down to it, that's a lot of trust to put into one single person. And I don't care how smart that person is. To declare with absolute certainty that there could never be a being like the God of the Bible in a universe this large and this intricate. And you can say that with 100% certainty so that you can declare Him impossible. You have to stop and ask yourself, wait a minute, if I am privileging this person with that level of all-knowingness, of omniscience, am I not actually treating this person in a way like God Himself? Because to make that kind of statement, you've got to have absolute knowledge that nowhere in this vast universe there exists, or outside of this vast universe even better, there exists a being like God. And so if you are looking at someone and you're saying this, and I'm privileging this to you, then you're treating them, in fact, like your de facto God. And when you really get down to it, if all you've done is substitute your own mini-God in place of the God of the Bible, then I have to ask whether we've made any progress in the discussion whatsoever. The second way we can answer that is to make the blind faith statement and simply say, because science. It's kind of funny. People think if you use the word science in a sentence, that faith is not involved. Well, no. Some of the deepest and most blinded faith I've seen in the 20th and 21st century comes from people who believe blindly in science. And so it implies that there's some kind of unchallengeable, infallible consensus amongst the men and women in white coats that there absolutely, positively never could be a God. Well, there are several issues with that. First, there's not a consensus. There are many really good scientists out there who argue just the opposite. They actually say that no, science and the evidence that science has brought us proves that God is necessary for the way this world exists. And if you want to get to know some of their ideas, I'd be glad to introduce you. But a bigger problem is the problem of what I call human observation. As wonderful as science is, and I got to make clear, I'm not bashing science. I like science. Science is a wonderful thing. I want science to continue to go on to cure cancer and do all of these amazing things. So I'm not bashing science itself. I'm bashing, I guess you might say, the idolization of science. When you start to treat science like it's a being in and of itself and a God in and of itself. But real science is based entirely on what? Human observation via the scientific method. That is what science is. That is what the scientific method is. And so, if we grant and assume that the universe is more or less what current cosmology says it is, then we'll start the discussion by saying that, okay, we'll grant that the universe is supposed to be around 13 billion years old. Now, what does that mean for science? It means that modern humans have been around for about 200,000 years of that 13 billion. That means that humans have had a chance to observe 15 ten-thousandths of a percent of what has happened in this universe so far. Of that 200,000 years, we have been practicing what we call science only since Roger Bacon in the 1200s. So if we're very generous and we say 800 years of what we consider to be science in any form whatsoever, then we're talking about 6 millionths of a percent of universal experience. That's if you took every single thing that every human being had ever experienced and put it all together, 6 millionths of a percent. And if we're talking about the experience of a single scientist like Stephen Hawking, we can add 3 more zeros to the picture. A single human lifetime is 1 billionth of 1% of what has happened in the universe. And of course, all of this is limited to a single nondescript planet in the middle of a not particularly distinguished galaxy, of which roughly 100 billion galaxies have been discovered so far. So what does all of this mean? It means that in the best and most generous case, for somebody to stand up and say that God is impossible, using impossible in the sense that we gave before, would be the equivalent of someone examining your house from 1 square millimeter of your backyard for 2 seconds and then declaring beyond all doubt who did and did not live there. Yeah. So the fact is that humans have no business declaring anything in this universe impossible, at least not based on what we currently know. Because the fact is, for all of the amazing things that we've discovered, and we've discovered some incredible truths about the universe, all the amazing things that we've discovered, we have discovered so tiny, such a tiny amount. It's not even funny. It only seems great to us because we're so small. And so that's also why the most honest and well-informed God doubters that you'll run into don't call themselves atheists. They call themselves agnostics because they say, I don't believe in God. I have not been convinced that God exists yet. I have not seen evidence that makes me think He does, but it could still be out there. You simply can't make the statement that God is impossible, at least not fairly. But what does the Bible say about God and the possible? Well, the Bible's pretty clear. Many passages refer to God being all-powerful, either directly or indirectly, and here's just a sampling. Matthew 19, 23 through 26, this is the rich young ruler. Jesus said to His disciples, "Truly I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. And again I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astonished and said, "Who then can be saved?" And Jesus looked at them and said, "With man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." And of course, pay attention to that particular phrasing. We're going to come back to it. Luke 1, 34 through 38, Mary said to the angel, "How will this be, since I am a virgin?" The angel answered her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And behold, your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, has also conceived a son. And this is the 6th month with her who was called barren. For nothing will be impossible with God. Mary said, Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be according to your word. And the angel departed from her. Matthew 17, 19 through 20. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, Why could we not cast it out? They were talking about a demon. And he said to them, Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like the grain of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, Move from here, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. And Job 42:2. I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. And as I said, that's just a sampling. Here's a slightly larger sampling of Old and New Testament scriptures that talk about God's omnipotence, God's power. God can do anything, and He tells us to ask Him for everything. So does that mean that the health and wealth preachers are right? The name it and claim it crew, the blab it and grab it. So you just have to pray to God and God's going to give you a brand new house. Or you pray to God and He's going to fix all of your problems. And of course, the implication is there are two implications with these guys. One is, if you're not getting what you want, it's because you haven't given me enough money. You have to sow the seed, they say. Or there's something wrong with your faith. And there's something wrong with you. I don't think so. I think there's something else at work here. Christians just in general have a hard time understanding this idea of the impossible. I found this in my news feed this week and I thought it was good. The cat and the screaming lady. I can do all things through Christ. You skip church when it rains. You know, we expect to do the impossible, but only when it's convenient. We expect to do anything we feel like. Yeah. So, let's talk a little bit about what this does not mean. If you just stop with the verses about God's omnipotence, that leaves us with a dangerously incomplete picture. One that the heretical health and wealth preachers leverage to take advantage of people and take advantage of their faith and of their money. It also leaves us with an equally dangerous false impression that God is there to answer whimsical prayers immediately. Why doesn't God give my daughter a purple unicorn when she asks for it? I mean, I know she has. I've seen her talk about things like that. So why doesn't God give her a purple unicorn? Why aren't Christians literally chucking mountains into oceans left and right when they just feel like it? Hey, I think I'll do some mountain juggling. Yeah, my faith is up to it today. It's mustard seed size. Yeah. But more seriously, why didn't He respond to my prayers and save my grandfather's life when he became ill? Why didn't He respond to your prayers in some really hard situations? And of course, I hope you see what I'm getting at here is stopping just with the omnipotence passages without looking at the rest of the picture. It sets up an unrealistic sense of entitlement. Like this idea that God's up there to give me whatever I want, whenever I want it, especially things that I personally think are worthwhile or are good. And what happens when you're disappointed? Well, it can seriously damage your faith. When you pray for something very, very, very hard and it doesn't happen exactly the way you want it to happen, some people lose their faith over this. And so, I think these clarifications are important. God is indeed all-powerful, but He does choose to limit Himself in some significant ways, and He wants us to understand that. First, nonsense does not stop being nonsense simply because someone starts speaking it about God. One of the most common refrains to, well, if God is all-powerful, why can He make a rock so big that He can't lift it? I mean, you've heard those kinds of arguments before. Well, the truth is that's not profound or even serious. It's just gobbledygook. You might as well have said something to the effect of, so can God create a glurb so large that He can't flarp it? Because a stone so big that it can't be lifted existing in this universe is like that two-dimensional square circle. It doesn't exist. It can never exist by definition. And God plays by His own rules. Therefore, it's no indictment of God's power to say that he can't make a square circle, or to say that he can't make a stone so big that he can't lift it. And notice what Christ himself and Job said about God. And you'll see that refrain again and again. God can do all things that are possible. So when we're not talking about God doing nonsense. And even when the angel is talking to Mary and he says nothing is impossible to God, in the context, he's not talking about creating a stone so big he can't lift it. He's talking about a woman having a baby. So we're talking about things that are consistently possible. So God, if it can be done, God can do it in this universe. He plays by his own rules. Next, God will not act in any manner that contradicts his nature, particularly his moral nature. So just because things are physically possible for him, it does not mean that he will do them. For example, one aspect of God's character is justice. So even though God has the ability to act unjustly, will he? No, he won't. So when we say that God is incapable of acting unjustly, then what we've said is, it is in no way an indictment against God's power. He will not violate the moral law, and unlike us, he doesn't have to. You know, we're down here trying to figure things out, and we screw things up. He's God. He's omnipotent. He's omniscient. He can do it perfectly. And there are some scriptures there for you on that. I'm afraid we don't have time to read them. And then finally, God does not act against his own will or his own plans. God knows what is best. And so, no matter how much we think he should, he's not going to do something that will violate his own will just because we feel like it. He's not going to automatically grant our every desire. And he certainly will not grant our every unconsidered, greedy, or angry, or prideful whim. All prayers are answered. Unfortunately for us, from our perspective, sometimes the answer is a firm no. And so, in short, all this means that God is the all-powerful creator of the universe. He's not a cosmic vending machine there to give us whatever we want whenever we ask for it. And we have to understand that. To use another analogy, he's our Father in heaven, and he gives us what we need. He's not our cosmic grandfather in heaven who runs around giving candy, miracle candy to all the kids. Here, let me give you some money. You know how granddads are. That's not what God is about. And so I don't say that lightly, because the fact is, that's hard. God does not give us everything that we want, everything that we pray for, because he knows better many times. And when it's one thing for me to stand up here and almost academically speak about the knowledge and foreknowledge of God and so on and so forth. But the truth is, one day all of us, if we have not already, are going to be staring down the barrel of a reality where God's going to say no, and it's going to hurt. Maybe it's a loved one. Maybe it's yourself. Maybe it's a job. Maybe it's a mother who wants a child. Maybe it's a child in the hospital. We don't know when we're going to face that. So this is not an easy truth. But there's good news. There are things that God wants us to understand on a positive sense about his omnipotence. First, he wants us to understand that he is in control. The fact that God is omnipotent, the fact that God is all-powerful, means there is nothing beyond him. And so, his plans for us, his plans for this world, will never be derailed. And that should be, as we go forward into the world, not knowing what the future holds, that should be a huge reassurance. So Romans 8:28, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Proverbs 16:4, the Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. So even the wicked, even the evil. Now, I'm not trying to say that God causes evil. That's a third sermon topic we could go into on a different day. But even the plans of the evil are not beyond God's ability to take care of them. Ephesians 1:7-10. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us in all wisdom and insight, making known to us the mystery of his will, according to his purpose, which he set forth in Christ as a plan for the fullness of time, to unite all things, things in heaven and things on earth. And so whatever we're going through now, and I mean whatever, even wars, famines, the whole of human history, it is going towards his end, and he will make all things right. The next thing he wants us to understand is that we should submit our will to his. And again, that is a very, very hard thing. We should be actively praying for his will to be done and not ours. Again, even in difficult circumstances. And the first example I can give of that, and it's the only one I'll do here because it is so important, I've got to hit it, is Luke 22:41-42. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, Jesus, and knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Just stop for a second and let that sink in. Jesus knows what's coming. It's 100% clear. He knows what's coming. And what's coming is the most painful and torturous death that human beings have ever been able to create on the face of this planet. There are some variations on this kind of death, but more or less, this is as bad as it can get. It's crucifixion. And he's looking at that and he's saying, you have the power to change this. I have the power to change this, but not my will, but yours be done. And of course, that's an even more important thing when you start up and thinking about it, that the reason he was there facing that was because of you and me. And he had you and me on his mind when he said, your will be done. And because of all of that, we can trust the Lord. It's one thing to say, I have to submit my will to you because I don't have a choice. My daughter has no choice, my younger. She has to submit to me. I'm bigger than she is, and I'm her dad. But it's a huge difference between that and willingly choosing to submit your will to someone. And so the fact that you can trust in the Lord means that not only is he going to take care of everything anyway, not only do you have no choice, but also you can willingly trust him. Psalm 121:3, he will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. And Philippians 4:19, and my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory. And because of that trust in the fact that he is omnipotent, he wants us to know that we do not need to be afraid, no matter what we face, no matter where we go. John 14:1, let not your hearts be troubled. And believe in God, believe also in me. And then Philippians 4:4-6. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And then Isaiah 40:31. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that fear is a sin or anything ridiculous like that. I've heard people say that. Fear is natural. It's a part of human life. But what we know when we fear is that we have the ability to trust in God and that he will take care of us. Someone said that bravery is not the absence of fear. Bravery is doing the right thing even when you're afraid. And I think that's a good definition, and I think it applies here too. And I think that's probably the number one application we can take away is that God is with us. Who can be against us? Thank you.